Okay, well, welcome everybody to this Google Hangout for the Configuring the World MOOC. And we have 4 students here, and we're going to address some of their individual questions and invite a discussion among themselves. We're open online at the moment, so if you have any questions you would like us to answer, send them in and we'll introduce them into the discussion. If I don't know the answer, somebody else might, and if we don't, then we can always look it up. So I have 4 people here: Stuart from the United Kingdom, Saeed from Iran, Giovanni from the Netherlands, and Raluca. Bang, already gone wrong. Raluca from Romania. Saeed is going to kick off the questions. I haven't prepared any of the answers or any of the questions. If I don't know the answer, I shall just say so, and we'll go on to something else, and I'll cover myself with embarrassment. But let's see how it goes. The others of you that are online, if you want to intervene, just put your hand up and enter the discussion, okay? So, Saeed, you had a question.
Hi to everyone. In fact, I have 2 questions, but related very much. So I start with the first one. My question is, how can we make sure that the configuration, that is the configuration of the world, is done from a really global perspective and not from a relative male Western scientific standing point. By scientific, I mean science in a limited fundamental sense, that is metaphor-free, lacking any kind of sarcasm. In other words, in the seemingly impossible task of configuring the world, how can we have an inclusive outlook, not only concerning the subject matter, but also concerning the perspective of the ones who are going to make the real act of configuration? This brings me to the second question, which is more concrete. And it is, I mean, it seems to me that there is a growing conflict on one hand between the international norms and laws, for example, the human rights, and on the other hand, the local national law, for example, the Sharia in Islamic countries. I have, for example, I would like to refer to Russia, which was once the forerunner of internationalism. But today, she is alluding to national standards and boundaries in defending its cases in Ukraine and in Syria. The question then is, how does political economy, as a scientific discipline, address this conflict, and how would it go for resolving it or dissolving it?
Okay, 2 good questions, 2 very large questions, which you'll be pleased to know there is not one answer. That's always been very academic. How can we ensure that there's a global perspective? That's a good question. But we can't assume that there is a global question. You see, having a perspective of the world, when you look at the world, you don't just look, you look with a framework of questions and a framework, if you like, of expectations. And what I've tried to suggest at the beginning of the course is we try to shed some of our expectations. And some people have criticized me of being very data-oriented, but data is to some extent neutral. It's also to some extent not neutral. But it allows you to look across a spectrum and then formulate a question. But the question is formulated by people, by societies. And so the question that is asked is not always from the same perspective. You see, looking at the present or looking at the past, there isn't one past. There are important factors in the past, less important factors, and ditto with the present. For you yourself, Saeed, you have a family, you have a past, you have an environment in which you've grown up, and for you that's very important. But for Giovanni, he's had a completely different area of what's important. So when he asks a question of the world, it will be different from your question. So the thought that we would ever agree on one perspective of looking at the world, I think, is as unrealistic as the expectation that we will all have one question that we want to ask of the world. So what we have to ask, therefore, is how can we get a consensus on the range of discussion? What do we consider legitimate to enter into our debate? What do we consider the common elements that we wish to discuss and the areas within which we would like to frame policy? And I think that is more possible than to say, will we ever have one single view of the world? But do you have a reaction to that, Saeed?
I think this is the crucial and the central question, because considering economics as a science, for example, science is essentially universal. It doesn't matter if you are from Iran or from the United States. When you talk scientifically, you are using universal criteria. You're measuring everything by universal criteria, or else there would be no science at all. So I think this is a challenge for economics as a science. How could economics and political economic go scientific, go universal and go scientific?
Saeed, were you in the discussion in the forum on whether economics was a science?
I was, yes.
Yeah. Economics is about human behavior. It is you and me making choices on how to spend money in situations of scarcity. When economics tried to project itself as a science, it said there are universal laws, supply and demand, and basically what all of us in the world, regardless of our role as producers or consumers, our position is to maximize our satisfaction, is to maximize our profits, is to maximize the utility in using things. That's why economics, the free market economics, predicts this sort of optimal way of allowing the world to develop. But political economy especially says, no, economics is not neutral. It's not that we all share these ambitions. There are more factors that influence the choices that we make than raw calculations of supply and demand that can be reduced by economics. Economics is a social science. It tries to establish expectations, we call rules, within boundary limits. But we have to accept that a lot of what happens in economics, and a lot of what happens therefore in the relationship of economics to politics, has more to do than these so-called objective rules. One of the factors you have to factor in when you move economics into politics is the phenomenon of power. You see, in economics and pure economic theory, you get big or small. It only matters when it dominates the market, but bigger or smaller matters an awful lot in politics. Also, when then you're following and formulating political ideas, you have to bring in what the political scientists call path dependency. You have to bring in history, culture, societies, and that comes in. So there is no way you can describe political economy as scientific in the same way as, for example, in your profession, where you have stresses of metals, the stresses of buildings, angles that you take into account to design a building. We can't design a world like we can design a mosque or a church or a temple. So I think the idea that there is a scientific answer to the world's problems is part of the problem in your question. There isn't. That would be my answer.
You mean, Professor, that you're not having any projects in economics and in political economy? I mean, as an architect, when I go to use the science of metals and structural science, I have a project. My project is to build a house, to build a castle, to build a bridge, to build a city, to build a country. And the science I go to is, I expect it to help me. Is economics and political economy and political science useful in this way as I use the science of statistics, for example, for implementation of my project. I understand that the project is something that happens, the idea of the project happens before the science comes in. But the science has to be positively useful. And that's why I'm here. I'm enjoying the course. I'm learning a lot of things that would surely help me in implementing my project. My project would be in this course worldwide. It concerns.
Let me come back, and because we're dominating this discussion, I'm going to open it, switch again in a minute. You say that there is a project and you have some rules and indications that help you guide your project, and of course you do. But what happens if the cement doesn't deliver, if the workers are not up to the standards that you require, if the funding dries up? Your project and your project planning will have to alter. Now, economics gives you a framework of expectations. We expect the world to go ahead at a certain tempo. We know that some countries will grow faster than others. We know that if there is a boom in China, prices will rise for raw materials. We try to anticipate all of that, and economics gives you a framework of where you can expect it to go. But it doesn't give you a definition to go that way. Now, we can link various statistics together and say, look, there is a statistical relationship between different factors, but it often goes wrong. And one of the things that goes wrong in economics, and this is a very simple thing, is there is a cycle that goes through the world economy every 6 or 7 years. And we see it banging in, creating crises. And it always comes from some individual act, but it always comes at the same sort of timing. Nobody understands quite why it's there, but the trade cycle is there. And the trade cycle would upset your project, and it upsets the economy. There's no way of neutralizing that. And if you then go from economics to politics and society, which is where political economy functions, the certainties and the predictability is much less. But Said, I'm going to come back to your second question on conflicts and laws, but I'm going to switch the discussion for a moment because you and I have been busy for a while. So if you neutralize yourself for a while on the microphone, and I will bring Stuart in now to ask what his question is. Stuart, over to you.
Hello there. My question is, can anything be done to improve the statistics coming out of the poorer parts of the world?
Well, that's a straight question. It's a very good question. And the answer is yes, there can be an awful lot done. Nigeria, for example, I quoted in the beginning of my lecture, at least I think I did, recently raised its GDP by 96%, a world record of a rebasing exercise. And that means basically that Nigeria's GDP estimates now are much better than they were before. They might not be 100% accurate, but at the moment it's better than in April before they did the revision. Now, what had happened there were 2 or 3 things together. Firstly, Nigeria hadn't done anything with its statistics, its GDP base, for about 20 years. So it was time it had to update the price relationships and other relationships. So that would have made a change in its GDP estimates anyway, because the relative prices of things that Nigeria produced will have altered. Secondly, there have been some changes in what to include in GDP statistics in the interval, and they've been taken on board. I don't think they're that important for Nigeria. They make a bigger impact elsewhere, but they were included. But thirdly, Nigeria took the opportunity to increase the number of businesses it actually asked questions of. So instead of asking about 80,000 businesses, it asked 800,000 businesses. And it revealed then a different story. So Nigeria was able to push up its estimates of GDP, but secondly, it got a much more refined picture of its GDP, that the enterprises like housing, real estate, internet services, mending bikes and motorbikes, etc., all turned out to be a very vibrant sector of the economy. Now, we did not it's not as though we didn't know that before. I mean, planners in Nigeria say, of course, you can see it. You go out in the street, you can see the streets are much more lively, but we have no numbers, so we can't do anything with it. Nobody counts them. So once you start counting, you can include them in the estimates. The estimates now of Nigeria are the best we've got. The trouble now is that all our growth estimates of how we got here are all a load of rubbish, because they've all been based on these out-of-date methods and everything else. So all our historical statistics all have to be redone, and often you can't recapture that data. So Nigeria's statistics are good. Kenya has just increased its GDP estimates by about 20%. That is probably more accurate than the estimate we had at the beginning of September. Changed nothing on the ground but our counting of it. Now, what then does Africa have to do to keep on that track? Well, two things. Firstly, one is that the statistical bureaus don't collect GDP figures. They get figures from all sorts of other bodies that intervene in the economy. They come centrally, and then they're compiled together to make up the GDP number. So if society doesn't regularly collect taxes from certain areas, doesn't register certain transactions, doesn't measure land use, then in no time at all, the statistical base will evaporate. That's the first problem. The second one is that these offices themselves and the staff are under-equipped. To compile a fictive number called GDP, or a number that you can't do much with, is an expensive political choice. And I recommended one book, and I have it here. Where is it? Trouble with Spontaneous Gestures. Excellent book here by Morton Jervin, who's written an entire book on African GDP statistics, which I think is quite an achievement, called Poor Numbers. And he describes going into these offices with one or two old-fashioned computers that you or I would have thrown away ages ago, people working with one strip light, and these are the people that have to produce the statistics. So it's not a priority. And the third thing is the base. The UN statistical agencies have been in continuous cooperation with all countries in the world to standardize statistics, to try to improve statistical methods in Africa and Latin America. So it's basically a statistical or a money choice, financial choice, and therefore a political choice, whether they decide they want those better numbers, whether they decide they need those better numbers, and I think whether they decide they can use those better numbers. And one of the things that came out with Nigeria in the discussion around their statistics was, yes, now we can target small industries because we know where they are, we know how big they are, and we can get some idea of how to target policy. So you can actually get policy operating now at what we call a meso level. In economics, you've got three levels: micro, meso, and macro. Macro is monetary policy. Micro policy is your decision to buy a house or to buy an ice cream or whatever. And meso policy is a sectoral policy. With these kind of numbers, you can have a much more efficient sectoral policy. So that's a benefit. So yes, they are improving. A lot can be done to improve them, but there is a political choice whether you want to put the money and the funds and the resources into improving your statistics. Do you want to come back on that, Stuart?
There was just one thing that you were talking about then, about people going into offices and it being quite Dickensian, perhaps. And I was just thinking when you were talking about the current crisis with Ebola in the countries such as Liberia, Sierra Leone, the people who are actually working there aren't going to be able to go out into the countries and collect the information for this, say, quarter, because it's just going to be so dangerous to do so, and so it's going to affect their statistics as well. So I just thought, is that going to be something that, because these are the countries that we need to be giving aid to as well, so that's going to affect aid deliverance as well?
It'll affect the statistics in the sense that, do we need precise numbers to know that countries are in need of certain kinds of help? A lot of statistics that we've been generating in the course, I've suggested, these beautiful indices I've been taking apart and you've been taking apart, and say, well, who needs these numbers? And very often it's political scientists or political economists who want to put them into sophisticated econometric models and give you results of correlations and regressions. Policymakers don't necessarily need that. You don't need to know that certain areas are poor, the exact number of poor or the amount of poverty there is, in order to realize there's a problem there. So we can be, if you like, over-specific in certain directions, our numbers. People are dying in Liberia, they're going to die whether you can count the dead or not. You know the question is increasing or you don't. So you can adjust your policy. You don't need the exact numbers. Just as in Nigeria, people knew that the economy was more diverse, but they couldn't put the number on it. I see you nodding your head. So I'm going to move across to Giovanni. Any of the others of you want to say something on this question of numbers? Giovanni, you're a number cruncher. Come on into this discussion. Come on now. Don't leave it.
Indeed, actually, well, I have a question which I can ask right away, if you like, and I also have a comment about what you just said about Stuart. And funny enough, the two of them are connected.
Okay.
So the original question I would like to ask you is the following: is that, of course, branding and index, so to say, can make your organization very popular. Many of us know about the Freedom House and the Freedom Index, or for those of us who are very interested in Africa, there is this Ibrahim Index of African Governance, which is also very popular, of course. But at the same time, it's a bit of a wasted effort, and it would be nice to see a common effort to design some parameters that can be of common interest in order to come up with something that is possibly more reliable than all of them. Why? I mean, are you aware of any such effort? If not, what is hampering such effort? And I don't know if you want to answer this before, or otherwise I can also add something to what you just commented on, Stuart.
What order do you think? I can come to this question straight away.
I believe it is okay, so please go ahead, and then I will comment on Stuart.
Okay. Well, I do have an answer. Who needs anything more reliable than all of them? Who wants these indices? I think that's a very important point. You do need indices, you do need numbers. So you need to know the population. I think getting GDP data is very useful too. But do you need one index for human development? The Human Development Index, UNDP, incredibly pleased that it's got this index, quotes itself by saying so many people, the most searched and quoted index in the world is our Human Development Index. I gave a lecture to our students. We teach our BA students here this course, so I come into that course giving case studies, and I looked at human development in Nepal. And you think, okay, brilliant. I mean, I don't think first-year students in the entire university have an entire lecture devoted to Nepal. So, question, why Nepal? Well, because the UNDP said it was a top mover. Out of all the countries in the world in the last 30 years, Nepal has improved its Human Development Index better than anybody else. I thought, wow, let's have a look. So I went and had a look, and basically, despite all the problems in Nepal, its income had gone up, but that wasn't the main driver. There were a couple of oil economies that improved, and that was their GDP, pushing up the Human Development Index. Wasn't that? Education had improved, but wasn't really that. It was life expectancy. Now, I thought, okay, where does that come from then? So I looked a bit deeper in the statistics. All of these statistics are provided by the UNDP. So one of the numbers I found, I mean, they wiped out malaria in the lowlands in Nepal. That was all very beneficial. One of the numbers I came across was the number for maternal deaths. How many women die in childbirth? And in 2010, it was something like 800 women for every 100,000 births. And that is about 100 times higher than in the West. Amazing death rate. And 3 years later, it was down to 170. I thought, hang on, there's no way. it must be a misprint. It must be 720 or something. It can't be 172. So I tracked it back, and it's not a misprint. So I thought, how on earth do you reduce female mortality in a period of 3 years? So I went through the information, and what had they done? They had a policy for producing female volunteer health assistants, several tens of thousands. This was a policy 30, 40 years ago. They can't afford doctors, so women volunteers come in and act as sort of first aid workers attached to villages. Then about 5 years ago, they started training midwives. Sorry, 10 years to be precise. Training midwives. They trained up about 4,000 midwives who could actually help these volunteer workers to give them advice on how to go about women in pregnancy. Then they increased the funding to hospitals so that there were more hospital beds for pregnancies and more drugs available. And specifically, they made anti-hemorrhaging drugs, blood clotting drugs available in the villages as well, because they thought that hemorrhaging after birth is one of the major causes. Then they gave grants to women to be able to travel from the village for antenatal care 3 or 4 times before they gave birth and to visit the hospital. The result within this 3 or 4 year period is that the number of women who had an attendant, either at a hospital or an assistant, rose from something like 30% to something like 70%. Now, all of those things happen because detailed statistics. None of it happens because of the index. The Human Development Index will tell you absolutely nothing, either about the location of this specific problem or any of the solutions to help solve it. So you have to ask yourself, why do we want these numbers? Well, the UNDP likes these numbers because it can brag about having the number and it can name and shame where are you on the ranking. And okay, it gives you a rough idea of where you are in the world of human development. Policymakers don't need the numbers, they need the numbers underneath. They don't need the index, they like the numbers that actually go to make it up, because that's where you can actually do some work. So who wants the numbers? Political scientists, political economists. Because with these numbers, they can throw our fictive number on human development, they can, and they do, throw it against our completely rubbish numbers on GDP for the developing world that they want to do, and they give you a statistical result to say these two things are linked to another fictive index, governance, or another index of trust, or another index of fractionalization. It's scientists, so-called scientists, who want to pseudo-precise their science to make it, Saeed, to make it really scientific. So it looks like the other sciences other people do. And that's why this course is important. Because if we don't undermine this kind of scientific experimentation at the source, then you'll start believing that all of this can be proved. And it can't be proved. You can anticipate it happening. You can think, is it likely to happen? You know, put your brain on and think, yeah, if a society is riven by political conflict, by social conflict, then it's likely to lead to war. Then people are unlikely to invest in it. It doesn't take a scientist to come to that. It does take a concerned citizen to come to that and actually be able to say something. So I don't think we should go for our perfect index. And I'm pretty horrified by it. I'm writing, next week you'll get my thoughts on cities. And they were just thoughts. So I'm now writing that section of the book. So I thought, okay, let's have a look at the top cities. My own stupid fault. I should never have thought of it. I came across a report which said, what do 130 indicators of cities have to tell us? It's about 400 pages big. I thought, 130 ways of gauging a city. And they do exist. And I have the report. And I thought, my word, where are we going in this world? But that is 130 city indices of their livability, their sustainability, and the really top ones are total world global cities. But do you need that index to stay right? Well, I think probably New York, London are going to be near the top, And I expect the third world cities to be coming up in the list, but I think Southampton or Leiden is not really going to be a world top city. Do you need the index? Well, if you can, I can give you the reference. But that's my answer to your question.
Well, thank you. I would love the reference, definitely. I have a comment on this which links also to what Said and Stuart have said, which is the following. I see people pretty eager of ranking things, ranking countries. Well, in this very specific case, it would be ranking countries. And sometimes it's really hilarious when I see, say, Norway and New Zealand fighting against each other to get the best HDI. And it looks that if you're doing number 3, you're doing worse than maybe the year before. And even more ironically, it happens at the bottom of the table, because one thing I've learned from this course is that data can be very poor, and especially when you have, as you mentioned before, very poor collections of data. So one question, or so to say, curiosity remark I have is the following. Why do still people use these ranking systems? Of course, the clear answer is easy. It's linear. So countries are ranked from 1 to, say, 200. Yet, I would love to see sometime somebody who says, well, these are the countries who are doing good. These are the countries that are doing less good. These are the countries that are doing not that good. And it doesn't matter if it is number 1 or number 5. But I believe that, as you mentioned in your answer to Said, there is no real scientific answer to some questions. So why should we try to give such a numerically precise answers?
Oh, I think basically it comes from political scientists who want to use and prove statistical relationships and therefore causal relationships between different sets of variables. And that requires some sort of ranking, but they don't do rank correlation. In other words, they don't necessarily put 1, 2, 3, 4 to 180 into the computer. They take the distance in between. So how far away are these countries from each other also goes in. But that, to some extent, also has a margin of error. Now, at the top, when you're dealing with fairly visible societies, open societies, that margin of error is likely to be fairly small. As you go down, the margin of error gets larger. And I've suggested at the bottom end, you can probably change one decile from the other without doing too much damage. And the problem is for people that are doing poverty, and we've spent a lot of time basically in this course heading towards the problem of poverty. I mean, that's what that middle section of the course has been about. It's at the poverty end, Africa, Latin America, and some parts of Southeast Asia, that's where your statistical basis crumbles. And yet that is exactly the point where they're trying to demonstrate these relationships. So it's a way to get published. I think in many journals, it happened to my topic, economic history. It went to econometrics, and if you didn't have half or 2 or 3 pages, half the article full of statistical formula, you would not get published in topic. And the same thing has happened in certain branches of political science. Now, I've been at conferences on European integration, my specific field, but other conferences where there is a real divide, which I hadn't realized, but a really vindictive divide between what is called American political science, hard empirical research with real numbers, and a sort of softy research, as they would brand it, people in the West, descriptive political science, normative political science, lefty political science, that doesn't crunch the numbers all the time, that therefore is unexact and non-scientific. And this is a real conflict of almost a culture within the subject. And it's one branch of the subject that likes, and I'm a very quantitative person. I like these numbers. When I started planning the course, I wanted to use these numbers historically, but if you can't trust today's numbers, you have not a chance of discussing the numbers of 40, 50 years ago. And as for the attempts to prove what Jesus Christ was earning or his father was earning at the year nil, which the Economist has just thrown up the data yet again, total income, per capita income in the year nil. I mean, what are we doing? But that's a different topic. I can rant for hours on this. I'm not going to. I'm going to move across and bring in Raluca has been incredibly patient there, smiling away. She's been following the discussion. Raluca, come on in and join this debate, please.
Thank you, Professor. My question will stick to the international economy, and I'm going to ask about the connection that I think there exists between the evolution from the international market, and here I mean the stocks fluctuating and the oil prices sliding, and also the major events from the international agenda, like the Middle East conflict and the Ukrainian. So I'm still wondering whether we can make links between these types of events from the different area of the international politics.
Okay, that's a good question. And the answer is obviously yes. So let's take it into two parts. Stocks and shares. And you have, I want to try to convey to you two sort of movements that are going on at the same time. There's a movement that says, oh, the news is bad, I'm not sure what's happening, I shiver, and I'll pull back a little from my exposure in the financial market. If I do that, then the price of stocks and shares will fall. So if I start getting bad news from the Middle East or bad news from Russia and Ukraine, I will pull myself back from the market. Okay? Now, behind that, there's a second movement that is swinging through, which I call the trade cycle, which, I mean, it's not always to do with trade. It's something that nobody really has explained, though everybody has an explanation for it. If they could explain it, they know when it was going to happen, and they never do. So I always think if you're going to say, look, I know why it happens, then you ought to say, watch out, next year it's going to come and hit you. If you can't do that, then I don't think you have an explanation. But basically, from around the 1840s and 50s, there has been a shock to the international system every 6, 7, 8 years. It used to be on speculative railway building. Now, railways, you build a long way, and until you get a traffic going on it, till you actually connect point A to point B, and you have some traffic going through, and you have some income, you have no income at all. It is purely speculative investment. And usually in the 19th century, some railway project would go bottom up in Latin America. The financiers of that railway project would collapse. The whole of the world would get a pull back, and you'd end up in a little recession, short, sharp recession. A dip in national income, usually lasting 18 months, 2 years, and then a bounce back. And this was the pattern of the world economy until the 1930s, where the Great Depression happened. Everybody had written books, why did the Great Depression happen? That's not the question they should have asked, because the Great Depression was more or less on time. We had one in 21, we should expect one in 29 or 1930. The problem was, why did it last so long? Why did countries not bounce back? And that became the critical question. And this is where, if you read the thoughts of Keynes, the little bit I put on Keynes on the internet, you'll see that Keynes comes to, look, it's up to government to try to smooth out fluctuations. Aside, you can, yeah, if you could mute yourself, then we won't hear your papers moving or the coffee beans or whatever it is there.
Okay.
Right, thanks. And so the cycle got muted because governments come in and intervene, just as they have done recently when the Lehman Brothers crash occurred in 2008. There'd been a collapse before in 1999. There'd been a problem in the early 1980s. There's the first oil crisis, 1973. So you can go back. These crises are still going through. And they'll appear on stocks and shares because it's investment that's usually the first indicator or the first sensitive thing that reacts when things start going wrong. So you have two things going on stocks and shares. One is this natural, I'm afraid of what's going to happen, a natural uncertainty that's there all the time, and this larger movement underneath that we're not quite sure why it happens and how it happens, but every time we think it's not going to happen, bang, it comes and hits us in the face. We're all surprised, crisis of capitalism again, and on we go. Are you happy with that answer?
Yeah, It's very easy to understand, and I really felt that it did answer my question. Thank
But
you.
there's a second thing that's happening, and then you asked about oil and
Yeah.
other raw materials. Now, they respond more readily to supply and demand. They also are speculative. If you think there's going to be a bad harvest in the future, you can buy futures, etc. This was all part of that swirling world economy mass I described in lecture 2. But basically, there is a real economy. If the Chinese economy is picking up and really making lots of manufactured goods, it requires lots of raw materials, and that will push up the price of raw materials because they can't be increased in production very quickly. If there's a bad coffee harvest in Brazil, the price of coffee in the supermarket will go up, has gone up by about 20, 30 cents, because that is feeding through the system. So there is a real supply and demand operating in various resource markets, especially in resources that you can't upscale or downscale very quickly. So the price of oil has a different dynamic. And one of the things you could say is, right, slow down in the Chinese economy, right, less potential oil demand. America fracking, producing more of its own energy, so the supply has gone up. The price of oil at the moment is softening. So this is another dynamic. If Russia says, no, I'm not going to supply any more gas to Europe, you'll see the price of energy shoot up again. But if they sell all that stuff to the Chinese instead, then the Chinese will buy that instead of something else, and you'll see the price alter again. So that's a rather different dynamic from the dynamic of financial movements that you've been questioning. Okay?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Saeed, you look as though you want to come in on that. How does that sound for your scientific expectations?
First of all, concerning the scientific status of economics, I believe that compared to, for example, to structural.
Saeed, there's something gone wrong with your connection. You've not only got worse, you've disappeared. I can't hear you at all at the moment. Can you, if you can hear me, will you wave? Yeah, he can hear me, but we got no connection to your sound. I'm going to try and get you to. No, we still haven't. We've lost Saeed at the moment. I mean, we haven't lost him. I mean, he's can't hear him. Okay, Raluca, I'm going to ask you. You've got more questions. I can see that. I mean, that was your prepared question. Have you got anything else you'd like to ask? I'm going to ask Stuart the same thing next because you came in with one question. Have you got an unprepared question? Anything you like. We'll talk frankly. What are you really curious about in this course, or about the way it's done, or whatever?
Actually, I found this course very interesting. For my specialization, I've made a master degree in international relations, so this course is perfect for me right now. And I'm still have a lot of questions about the international politics right now, and also about, let's say, the American coalition, if we can say that America has made together with other of Middle East countries in order to get a response and answer the threat from Syria. And I read some articles about our students saying that in this debate, they believe that American position is more dangerous, let's say, than the threat from Syria. And I'm wondering, how would you comment on this?
Oh, you're asking me for a comment that is outside the strict neutrality of the course. So I'm going to be academic. I'm not going to answer your question. I'm going to answer around the question. I don't see why we are in Syria and Iraq in the way that we are, it is evident to me that you can drop very expensive bombs on a few ill-equipped fighters till the cows come home, and you still won't stop ISIS advancing. The only way you could actually have an effective bombing campaign is to hit concentrations of troops and concentrations of munitions, concentration depots. That's where you drop expensive bombs, you get big results. But at the moment, we are spending an awful lot of money to kill 1 or 2 people at a time armed with rifles or whatever. You need boots on the ground, and if you're not going to put boots on the ground, you're not going to change the result. So somebody has to actually get in there and fight the fight. You can't fight this war with bombs without killing the people you're trying to save. The second thing then is, if you do put boots on the ground, what are you going to do next? What is your end result? Why are you there? What's the society going to be that you're going to leave behind? It's not as though the Americans have a glowing, or the rest of the coalition have a glowing record in post-intervention history. Part of why the mess is going on at the moment is the last invasion. We've left Afghanistan waving the flag saying, oh, we've been victorious and it's all been a great success, and we've left it to fall apart in its own way. We don't have a good, it's not an exit strategy, we just don't know what's going to happen next. And I think partly because our intervention creates the problem as well as solves the problem. Every guerrilla we kill, every bit of collateral damage, oh, I'm sorry, produces to some extent the next part of the reaction. So, yeah, I am too worried about our intervention. I personally think that these local problems are best solved locally. So I would be perfectly happy to see Iran or Turkey intervening, because I think that will make a lot more difference than the American intervention at the moment. But that's my answer. As I say, it's a non-answer of what I think. And I'm getting questions now from outside. So we've invited people to send in questions. So I'm going to pick up and answer 1 or 2 of those. Is that okay with you guys? So Hydrius from Lithuania asks, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the UK being in the Eurozone? He also asked a more specific question, but I'll answer this one. And I can see Stuart thinking, well, I can answer that question because the UK isn't in the Eurozone. It has its own currency. I think the question, though, needs to be addressed. What are the advantages and disadvantages of UK being in Europe, being in the European Union? And the advantages are several. Firstly, it is protection-free access to European markets in both directions. If in the past you actually had to go through all the customs duties, all of the different levels of protection, that will actually have a cost for the United Kingdom. Now, those protection levels have gone down anyway and generally, so I think the biggest question then is to say, what is likely to happen if the UK leaves? Now, one thing in Europe, it has a common market, and that means that the laws and regulations governing product definition, standards, etc., are also fairly equalized. And this is why you're able to have goods going across frontiers of highly developed economies, highly developed goods without any control. If England were to leave, it might be able to maintain its market access, but it would only be able to do so on the same terms as, say, Norway does. Norway is a member of the European Economic Area. It has access to the European market for industrial goods, but it has to implement all of the regulations of the rest of the community without really having a say in its shaping. So the UK could, if it wanted, keep its market access and move outside, so it doesn't have to pay any money for it. It can adopt certain other policies separately, but to maintain its market access, it's going to have to be what we call a policy taker. And I'm not sure how that relationship would work. I don't think it will be a very happy one at all, probably more unhappy than the one they're in at the moment. Stuart, what do you think on that?
I think that the advantages of being in Europe are economic, and they're economic, but they're for big business. I don't particularly think that small businesses such as mine really get anything from being in the EU or any free market. And I think the disadvantages to the UK and probably to most countries in the EU are more societal rather than economic. I think the free movement of people is good for big business because it keeps the wages down, but the people in the UK are not getting wage inflation at the same rate as goods are going up. I know I sound like I'm a spokesman for some political party in the UK, but that is how it is on the ground. So I think it is advantageous to big business. I'm not so sure that it is advantageous to small business, and I think at a societal level, it creates more problems than it solves.
I'm going to come back with you. I'm not going to address your problem. You have concerns, and they are real concerns. What was interesting in the independence debate with Scotland, as you know, just had a referendum whether it should be independent from the UK or not. What I found interesting is that the Scots have generally, in their official statements, been pro-EU. That Scotland would definitely like to be an independent member of the European Union, because at the moment, its voice in the European Union has to go via that of the UK. And as an independent country, and it wouldn't be too small, it'll be larger than Lithuania, larger than Denmark's own population, it would actually have a say in European matters, which it doesn't have at the moment. That would be political. What's your reaction to that then, Stuart?
If Scotland had gone independent and they wanted to be in the EU, I wouldn't have any problem with them that happening. I know that if the Scots got independence, that would create problems in other parts of Europe, in Spain and Belgium maybe. So it's I wouldn't have any problem with them being with the Scots as an independent nation. I actually thought that they should go for independence, but I don't see any problem with them being members of the EU and England and Wales, Northern Ireland not being members of the EU.
As Welsh descent, I dissent from that. I want to stay in the EU. Raluca, you're part of the problem, according to Stuart. All you Romanian going over to England and taking their jobs. What's your position in the European Union?
I think it's a very big debate about Romanian going in the West, and I can only say from my perspective, as I'm living in Dublin, so it's another city from the West. Yeah. And right now here I can see any problem with this issue. Maybe it's just a local problem in England, but here in Dublin in Ireland is not a problem with the Romanians, and the people don't feel threatened by Romanian coming and taking their jobs. And I think it's a normal attitude to have, as we are talking about flux of migration, and it's something that the state cannot stop but only limit. So it's something that happens in an area of globalization, and we can only make or talk about different types of politics that can limit and can give a proper response to the problem, as to not infringe the rights of the migrant to come and work, as in European Union is a free right to move around and establish wherever you want, but also to protect the rights of the locals that have the rights to keep their jobs paid at, let's say, the local level of payment, and not taken by others that accept a lower payment than them.
Okay. Whoops. I've been given signals now. It's time for us to wrap up a bit. I got a question in from Andy in Hong Kong, who said, what are the consequences of the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York? And I was a little skeptical of this Occupy Wall Street, this scepter of big business controlling everything. But next week, lecture 8, I surprised myself. And I think the results of lecture 8 that's coming next week will surprise many of you. The extent to which financial control is exercised over a large part of the financial system surprised me. And I think it does raise large consequences of democratic control for us all. But that'll be addressed in the lecture. So, Andy, it's a good question, and I hope you enjoy that particular lecture. I'm not too frightened by it. It remains for me to thank all 4 of you for being here, to thank those of you who managed to get questions through to us for participating, to say that this is my first Google Hangout, and I've enjoyed it very much. It's been nice talking to you guys, and it's nice seeing you, Giovanni, again. I hope you enjoy the course. There'll be some initiatives announced when we wrap up the course of how we're going further, and if you're concerned with the course and would like to help develop our ideas, we'll be inviting you to come on board and work with us in the follow-up for this MOOC. So I'm looking forward to doing that. We're going to go very innovative of trying to create a new type of MOOC, working together with everybody out there, 2,500 of you in the Facebook group, 3,000 odd who participated in the forums. We want to work with you to design a new course, a follow-up course of this one, where we push the frontiers of what we've been discussing 2 or 3 steps even further and try to get what we're actually going to do about it all together. So thank you all very, very much for being here. Thank everybody out there for watching us, and to say I'll see you again in the lectures and the weekly recordings. So thanks a lot for watching, and from us all here, goodbye.